Hi everyone, it's nice to meet you. This is Ryan, and thanks for watching the video. So I've been reading a lot of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche really deconstructs Plato and Kant. And I had read all of Plato's work, but never have I read Kant's key work, The Critique of Pure Reason, or CPR. So as I stated, I think I put in the description that the CPR is possibly considered the most important work of Western philosophy since Plato. So I spent roughly the last year reading Kant's CPR. As a caveat, I'm not a philosophy scholar, but you could say I'm a hobbyist. And it was really difficult to understand the CPR, possibly because I used a Cambridge translation, which was considered one of the most faithful but complex. So I would slowly read about 10 pages a week or so, and usually I'd put each paragraph into ChatGPT after I read it to get a better explanation of what is being said and to ask questions. So I hope to present to you what I took away from the reading over the last year and simplify it so someone who hasn't heard of this work can really walk away with a sense of what it's about. At its core, the CPR asks one big question. And the question is, what is knowledge? So in that sense, it's a work of epistemology. But if you may ask, why bother, right? Why bother to try and define what knowledge is? What's the benefit? Right, so why bother? Okay. A nihilist might say, why bother? Well, I think the benefit of defining what knowledge is power. You get power. And at Kant's time, there was a big power struggle going on between the church and science. I guess the power struggle was called the Enlightenment. Both sides were claiming they could define knowledge, and more importantly, that they could prove things about God, existence, morality. So the people who controlled knowledge controlled morality and could really tell everyone what to do. And so there were four main camps at the time. There were dogmatists, rationalists, empiricists, and skeptics. And the dogmatists believed that power came from divine words of God, that no further explanation was necessary. Essentially, it's in the Bible. The rationalists believed that the words in the Bible and more could actually be proven by theoretical, logical, rational arguments. And they would do things such as a proof of God as a first mover, for example. Empiricists believe mainly that God is proven by observing nature and that no rational theory could do it. And skeptics believe that no one could really prove anything. So Kant, as a man, was incredibly scientific and rational. He was also incredibly pious as a devout Lutheran Protestant. So Kant, I think, was really right in the middle. He really believed in science, but also believed that we must be able to say something about God. So if there's one thing a beginner I thought could walk away with from watching the CPR is this video. Let me play it for you. Can't touch this. Can't touch this. All right, okay, I'll pause that. But one thing that I thought when I read it was, with Kant, you really can't touch this, you know. So what Kant does in his Critique of Pure Reason, he critiques all the arguments of every existing thinker, from dogmatists and rationalists to empiricists and skeptics, and he leaves us showing us that all of them are wrong, basically, and that on the core topics of knowledge, especially around the soul, the world, the God, metaphysical knowledge, that no one can touch this. He destroys all the illusions of the prior metaphysicians, but at the same time he unifies their thought with a new metaphysical framework, and it explains why they were all wrong, but also why they were all partially right. And Kant does leave us with some very important things we can say about knowledge that no one had considered before. So I created this graphic to show the structure of the CPR. What is interesting is that this work is highly hierarchical. There are many nested structures. headings, subheadings, subheadings. And I think the structure of the work speaks as much as its content. Aside from the introduction, which I'm going to skip over, there are really two major parts to Kant's CPR. Part 1 is the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, and Part 2 is the Transcendental Doctrine of Method. The Transcendental Doctrine of Elements defines like the parts of thinking. Kant tries to define all the elements within our mind, but also how the mind connects to the world via space, time, and causality, etc., to create knowledge. And I consider the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements like a periodic table of elements, like in chemistry. But instead of chemical elements, we have elements of our mind reacting with the world to create knowledge. Part 2, the Transcendental Doctrine of Method, is shorter, and it's more information on exactly how these elements are combined with the world to create knowledge. So we're going to focus on the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements to start. And this is all the elements of thinking. The Transcendental Doctrine of Elements itself is divided into two parts. Part 1, the Transcendental Aesthetic, which is very tiny. It's super tiny, about 22 pages. But the Transcendental Aesthetic is very important. And then there's the Transcendental Logic, which is super long. It's about 374 pages out of 500 or so pages in the book. So first, let's look at the Transcendental Aesthetic. The Transcendental Aesthetic describes the elements of sensation, and that's how raw sensory data enters our minds. You can think of like sights, sounds, smells, touch, and Kant defines some key things here. He gives us the faculty of sensibility, which I've put in the diagram as like a cylinder in the person's head. The faculty of sensibility is inside our mind. And if our mind is like a computer, the faculty of sensibility is like the inputs, like the webcam and mic stream coming in. It picks up all the raw sensory data from the world via our nervous system. The next thing that Kant defines is the object in the world, which I put as a question mark on the slide. This is the thing that we are observing with our senses, and Kant calls this a thing in itself, or the thing in itself. A key innovation Kant brings in here is that we can never see the real thing in itself, only a representation of it. Then he introduces the manifold of intuitions, which I've put on the screen as those pixels you can see up there. The manifold of intuitions exists inside the faculty of sensibility, and this is our actual representation of the thing in itself in, say, our nervous system. Another key innovation that Kant made was his understanding of space-time. In the past, we had Newton, who said space-time are real in the empirical world. Leibniz, and I guess Einstein later, said space-time are actually in the relationships between objects in the empirical world. But now Kant brings us the opinion that space and time are in our mind. He was the first to put forward this interesting idea, and it's still possible he is true. It's, I guess, the basis of quantum theories today. Again, Kant says that space-time are ways in which our mind organizes the world. So if the Transcendental Aesthetic is all about the senses, then the next section, the Transcendental Logic, is all about our understanding. And it's how we derived concepts from those senses. So in the image, I've put a shark, and I'm imagining, you're swimming in the ocean, you're just feeling all the water, you're not really looking or thinking about anything, but then suddenly this object comes up to you and it's a shark, and your brain sees it sensorily, but then you suddenly go, oh, it's a shark. And the concept shark arrives in your understanding. So how does that process happen? The movement from the senses to the understanding. Well, that's done, the understanding is done by the faculty of understanding. So the faculty of understanding is covered under the big section called Transcendental Logic. As mentioned, it's the longest part of the whole book, and it looks at how does the brain take that mishmash of sensory input, the raw pixels, and turn it into, say, a shark. If the Transcendental Aesthetic is all about senses, then the Transcendental Logic is all about thinking. And the transcendental logic is also broken into two parts. The transcendental analytic, this is where Kant builds up his theory on how the mind thinks and interacts with the world. It's his positive contribution. And there's the transcendental dialectic, which is a critique of all the other major metaphysical positions of the time, specifically focusing on refutations on the ideas of soul, cosmos, and God. So the dialectic is his negative addition to his theory. So we're going to take a closer look at the transcendental analytic and how the understanding constructs experience. The transcendental analytic is also divided into two parts, the analytic of concepts and the analytic of principles. So we're going to start with the analytic of concepts. This describes how our faculty of understanding connects to that manifold of intuitions to create a concept like shark. To answer this, Kant begins with Aristotle's table of judgment, which talks about all the possible ways logic, independent of experience, can work. To illustrate, imagine you have no real world at all, just a brain in a jar. What does a brain in a jar think? So Kant begins by enumerating all the ways a brain in a jar can possibly think, using Aristotle's pure logic. When it comes to pure logic, there's only four basic ways we can think. It's quantity, quality, relation, and modality. And within each of those, we have sub-ways of thinking, which Kant describes. Quantity has universal, singular, particular. Quality has affirmative, negative, and infinite. Relation has categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. And modality has problematic, esoteric, and apodeictic. So Kant's big idea is that there's these general types of logic that are systematically complete are also the very structures through which our mind organizes experience when it encounters the world. But there are some important differences between Aristotle's table of judgments and what Kant comes up with. So to show us how logic works not just in a brain in a jar, but in a mind engaging in the world, Kant transforms Aristotle's table of judgments into what he calls the categories of understanding. And he justifies this transformation in his famous transcendental deduction. To do this, Kant makes four key moves. He introduces the transcendental unity of apperception, the faculty of imagination, the process of synthesis, and then the categories themselves. Firstly, the transcendental unity of apperception. The first move Kant makes is saying that in order to get a concept from the manifold of intuitions, we first need to unify the manifold to be perceived from a single point. So there needs to be an observer doing the observing. So Kant introduces the transcendental unity of apperception, which is like a fancy way to say self-consciousness or our thinking being. And I put that as the yellow dot on the slide. The transcendental unity of apperception is part of the faculty of understanding. Secondly, Kant introduces imagination, or the faculty of imagination. Imagination is like our store of blueprints of what we are aware of. All the things we know of, like a shark, a table, and a chair. And we'll learn these are built via experience as well. As we see things in the world, we come to develop a blueprint about the things we've seen. So the imagination combines with the manifold of intuitions and with the faculty of understanding through the transcendental unity of apperception. And these three things combine in a process called synthesis. It's right here where Aristotle's logic, which Kant now calls the categories of understanding, it gets applied, and voila, the end result is the manifold gets reduced to fall under a concept. In this example, we see shark. Lastly, Kant presents us with the categories again. And he explains that categories no longer describe how we reason, but they actually become interior structures in our mind that must always apply before we can think or know anything at all. So I've said a lot, and I've explained nearly half the book in 15 minutes. I've glossed over, obviously, a lot of detail, but I'm trying to get the core messages out for someone who hasn't read this work to understand it. And I like this particular image, which I think really captures this part of the book. It's showing Kant, that's Kant in the picture, and his huge brain. And it's saying that Kant says space-time exists in our mind. You can see it at the top of the image, and that's in the faculty of sensibility. And then the categories exist in our mind as well, in the faculty of understanding. So whenever we see anything, whether we feel any sensory input or have any conscious conceptual thought, we're interfacing with those aspects of the brain as they connect to the world. And I like that he's playing billiards, so that's a very logical sport, which Kant would probably appreciate. Okay, we just looked at the analytic of concepts, which was the major parts of thinking, but now we look at the analytic of principles. It goes into more detail about how thinking is actually applied. So Kant makes 3 big moves in this section. He introduces 3 more big parts about how thinking happens. Firstly, he introduces judgment. It's a brand new faculty, the faculty of judgment, and judgment is what takes a concept and links it to the manifold. So in the last section, we could think shark, and also we could look at the world and see an object that may or may not be a shark. But judgment is what links the two together and goes, that is a shark. Judgment is also covered further in his later works, I think in the Critique of Practical Reason and the Critique of the Power of Judgment as well. And judgment, it seems, is something that is built solely through experience. So the more sharks you've seen, the better you are at understanding what a shark is. The next concept he introduces is schematism. We looked very briefly at the imagination in the last slide, I think, and how it works. But in this section, Kant expands on the imagination by introducing a concept called schemas. He describes how the things we know, like shark or table or chair, exist as blueprints, but the blueprints, he calls them as schemas, and they live inside our imagination. And he also explains how the categories are applied as schemas too. So if you have a category of substance or causality, they exist as schemas when they interact with the world. Thirdly and lastly, Kant explains that when the categories become schemas and are applied to reality to bring us knowledge, we should call them principles instead. So they become more like laws of thinking. This entire system of sensing and thinking that Kant is building, he refers to as an architectonic. Another key point that is developed in this section are the concepts of phenomenal and noumenal. Remember how he said that the thing in itself could never actually be seen, the question mark on the slide, and we only see a representation of it in our from our manifold of intuitions. Well, this is how Kant further talks about 2 concepts, phenomenon and noumena. Phenomenon refers to that representation of the thing in itself, and the noumena refers to the thing in itself that we can never ever see. This is important to tease out because these terms are used in future philosophy. We have a whole school of philosophy called phenomenology, which is based on Kant's division here. Okay, we can kind of exhale a little bit. We've just finished the entire Transcendental Analytic, and this is where Kant built his theory of how thinking works. Now we move to the Transcendental Dialectic. Remember how earlier I said the dialectic is like a critique of all the existing metaphysical theories? Also, in the dialectic, Kant introduces something very important that we haven't really discussed so far in his architectonic. He introduces the faculty of reason. So before we go into his critiques of the soul, the world, and God, let's look at the beginning of the Transcendental Dialectic, where Kant looks more closely at how reason works. Reason is a brand new faculty. So you can take a look at the diagram. And at this stage, you've actually completed all Kant's faculties in the CPR. We have sensation, which is our intuitions, imagination, understanding, judgment, and finally, the crowning faculty, reason. I believe there are more in his later works, like will and desire, but I think this suffices for now. Reason is a faculty that draws inferences from phenomena. It's like the part of our mind that watches concepts and reality and sees patterns and rules of things that always seem to occur. Reason then creates for us outputs. These outputs are like rules about the world, say like numbers or even ideas about the world that don't really exist in reality, but these ideas allow us to have systematic completion in the set of outputs. Key metaphysical outputs of reason are ideas like God, world, and cosmos. If we inference to the greatest extent, then we're left with an ideal, which is the biggest single idea we can have. And this is what Kant calls God. So after we've defined this faculty of reason, we move on to Kant's critiques. As I mentioned, he does critiques on the soul, the cosmos, and on God. So let's start with his critiques on the soul. He looks at all claims made about the soul, or what he calls psychological theories. And I'm not going to go into these in detail, but he gives us 4 paralogisms, which are 4 fallacies about the soul. And he shows the illusions in the logic by applying his new framework to the problem. And he derives some clarity around it. And he says, you can't say the soul is a substance. You can't say the soul is unchanging. You can't say the soul is indivisible. And you can't say the soul is immortal. So he disproves all the existing theories about the soul by showing the fallacies or the paralogisms in the logic. So I just put that there so you're reminded that, well, you can't touch this, right? So he's shown they're all wrong. Let's go to the next slide. Now Kant moves on to discuss the world, the next metaphysical concept, which is under the field of cosmology. He takes 4 core metaphysical claims about the world and shows how for each statement he can make a proof showing that they are either true or false. And he calls these dual proofs antinomies. He provides a proof for both a thesis and an antithesis for each. The 4 he looks at are that the first being, he shows a proof that the world must have a beginning in time and space. But then he also shows another proof that says the world can never have a beginning in time and in space. So these 2 parallel proofs are both true, but they hold opposite conclusions. So they're an antinomy. He then looks at the proof saying that every object is comprised of simple parts. And he creates another proof that says every object is infinitely divisible. He then looks at a proof saying that free will exists. And he creates another proof showing that free will does not exist. Then he looks at a proof showing there is a God. And then he looks showing another proof that there cannot be a God. So I'm not going to go through the actual proofs, but the point is for every proof, he can also do a contradictory proof. So they're antinomies. So on the topic of cosmology, Kant has shown you can't touch this, discrediting every prior thinker from a rational perspective. Finally, Kant looks at God, which is in the field of theology, and he describes this as the ideal of pure reason. He looks at the 3 classical proofs of God, the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the physico-theological argument, and he disproves each of these. So once again, with Kant, you can't touch this. Okay, so we can exhale a little again. We've just finished the Transcendental dialectic. And a key takeaway of the Transcendental dialectic is that you can't say anything about the soul, that it's simple and immortal. We can't say the world has a beginning, nor can we say we have free will. And we can't prove that God exists. So Kant leaves us with a very skeptical point of view. But the appendix is a very, very important part of the CPR. And this is where Kant says that even though these concepts, like God, soul, world, even though they're illusions and they aren't true, they still have value as regulative principles. The best way I can describe these regulative principles are like parts of a map, with the soul being you are here marker, the world being the compass and the edges of the map, and God being the map in its entirety, the paper and the grid lines. Using a map is very useful in life, so we shouldn't discard it, so Kant would say. It offers us regulative principles. For Kant, God isn't objectively true. We can't rationally prove that it exists, but it is practically true as a kind of map, which he calls a regulating concept. So we've come a long way. We've gone through Kant's entire Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, our periodic table of elements of how thinking works. We've also debunked why all other metaphysicians before him were wrong. Now we move on to the Transcendental Doctrine of Method, which describes more on how we can correctly use reason to create knowledge. The Transcendental Doctrine of Method is often skipped by readers because it is much shorter. It's 79 out of the 500 or so pages in his total work, and it acts as a recap of much of what we've already covered. It has 4 major parts: the discipline of pure reason, which explains the rules reason must follow when proving anything; the canon of pure reason, which gives us the questions reason is allowed to ask; the architectonic of pure reason, which describes how reason itself always wants to create a kind of systematic unity; and the history of pure reason. This is how Kant's architectonic came about and how it may give us a secure path forward to treat metaphysics scientifically. So we're nearing the end of my video. I want to thank you for staying along so far. In conclusion, Kant's CPR does one really major thing. It proves that theoretical reason cannot prove that God exists. It takes power away from the dogmatists and the rationalists. But Kant also does another very important thing. By defining God as a regulating concept, he does allow us to say some things about it as a concept. So in this way, he disproves the empiricists and skeptics too, taking some power away from them. Kant is remembered as the Enlightenment figure for philosophy. And what Kant leaves us with, I think, is the idea that if we believe that a better world is possible, that is, that moral progress is possible and it's not just all chaos, and if we believe that reason is the best tool for us as humans to achieve moral progress, then we can prove God exists and is necessary as a regulating principle on the grounds of practical reason, so on the grounds of morality. So to sum, for Kant, if you want a better world and you believe a better world is possible and you think reason is the way we get there, then you must believe in God, because God is an ideal of pure reason. And even though it's not theoretically true, it is true as a regulating principle. So you need a map, even though the map is not reality. At this point, this is where his next book takes off, The Critique of Practical Reason, which looks at how we can justify a proof of God on practical grounds, on moral grounds. But if you don't believe that a better world is possible, maybe there is nothing but chaos, and you don't maybe think that reason is our best way to get there, then you don't need God. And just like Tinkerbell in the Peter Pan movies, if God will die if you don't believe in him. So Kant has been accused of being very wrong too, and I'm not saying I believe he is correct. I heard somewhere say that Kant is said to be smuggling Jesus, and I like that phrase, because Kant says that God can't be proved theoretically, but he says God can be proven morally, as a practical moral necessity. So in his next book, The Critique of Practical Reason, Kant goes on to show how the basis of morality is his golden rule, which he calls the categorical imperative, which is the same as love thy neighbor as you would love yourself, or do unto others as what you would have them do to you, which is, I think, Jesus's rule, or a Christian rule. So one of Kant's biggest dissenters is Nietzsche. Nietzsche calls Kant the wizard of Königsberg in a derogatory sense. Königsberg is where Kant lived, and he thinks he's a sort of insane wizard. In Nietzsche's work, after Kant already proved that no theories of God's existence were true, but Kant gave us a moral grounds for proof of God, Nietzsche then, in his works like Genealogy of Morals and Beyond Good and Evil, actually destroys Kant's proof on moral grounds. So, we're left with God is dead. There's no grounds for the existence of God at all. Okay, so I want to thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation, and here's a happy nihilist for you.